Hello, everybody, and welcome to this panel on counterterrorism in an age of great power rivalry. My name is Paula Köhler. I studied my master's in terrorism and counterterrorism at King's College London, and I currently work for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Germany. But today, I'm very happy to be here in the capacity for Atlantic Forum to moderate this panel. And I think it is a very timely panel, and it's very important that we look a bit at counterterrorism and how NATO currently does it, because a few years back, everybody's focus was on counterterrorism, and whether it was the media, the military, or governments, everybody had their minds on it. And there were basically daily headlines about what was going on with ISIS. However, since then, the threats that the alliance and therefore also its member states are facing seem to come more from states and countries such as Russia and China. And therefore, NATO has adjusted its strategy, and rightly so. Yet, the threat of terrorism has not vanished with the headlines, unfortunately, and it is as big as it ever was. So, NATO is now in the difficult position where it has to tackle new great power rivalries while simultaneously not forgetting the threat that is coming from terrorism, and doing all of that with limited resources. However, as the strategic narrative shifts, it also opens up opportunities to ask tough questions on NATO's counterterrorism approach and to rethink its goals. And that is exactly what we're trying to do here today. And I think there are many issues that we should discuss. For example, what have we learned in the last 20 years of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency? Which challenges lie ahead in counterterrorism, and is NATO ready to face them? And how should counterterrorism look like going forward? I am very excited that today there are four excellent speakers and experts on that issue who are going to discuss this with me. With me today is Tanya Mera, who's a senior research fellow and program lead for rule of law responses to terrorism at the International Center for Counterterrorism, The Hague. Previously, she worked at the TMC Assa Institute, where she was engaged with conducting needs assessment missions, capacity building projects, and training activities. She worked as a senior consultant to the United Nations on developing global guidelines to facilitate the collection of information and evidence by the military within a rule of law framework. At ICCT, Ms. Mera is currently leading a project exploring the criminal justice responses to the linkage between terrorism, transnational organized crime, and international crime. And she is involved in research projects exploring the trafficking of small arms and light weapons as a source of financing for terrorist organizations. We are very lucky that she can be here today with us. Then with us today is also Dr. Jack Watling, who is a research fellow for land warfare at RUSI. His research focuses on force modernization, deterrence against Russia, and the future of war. Prior to joining RUSI, Jack worked in Iraq, Mali, Rwanda, Brunei, and further afield. Originally a journalist, he has contributed to Reuters, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, Jane's Intelligence Review, Haaretz, and others. Mr. Watling was shortlisted for the European Press Prize Distinguished Writing Award in 2016 and won the Breakaway Award at the International Media Awards in 2017. Thank you so much for being here today with us. Also with us is Kenneth L. Layson, who's an intelligence and security expert who lectures at the University of Antwerp as an assistant professor. He is the author of a bestseller on Belgian intelligence and security, and he publishes in the Journal of Strategic Studies, International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, Terrorism and Political Violence, as well as other leading security journals. He was educated at the universities of Ghent and Leuven in history, and at Brunel University London and the University of Cambridge in intelligence and security studies. Thank you for being here. And last but not least, we have Marisa Machnikova, who is the Atlantic Forum Community Manager currently, and who is working for her diploma in international organizations from the European Academy of Diplomacy. She has worked for the Embassy of the Czech Republic in London and for the European Economic and Social Committee of the EU. She holds a Master of Arts in Politics of Development with a distinction from Royal Holloway, University of London, and her areas of expertise include European counterterrorism, cyberterrorism, as well as terrorism in the modern age. I'm very excited that all of you could be here today, and without further ado, I think it's time that we get started. Tanya, the floor is yours.
I thank you, Paula, for the introduction. Nice to be here, even though it's a Saturday. I hope the participants will enjoy the session today. I don't think I need to do any further introduction. I want to focus on in my approximately 10 minutes, so let's see how much we can cover. I wanted to discuss briefly the trends we see in terrorism. So that is the rise of right-wing extremism, the changing nature of armed conflicts. The third aspect I wanted to focus on is the anti-government conspiracy thinkers, violence, and last but not least, the continuing threats posed by jihadism. And if time allows, I will say a few words on battlefield evidence. So in recent years, I mean, right-wing extremism is getting more and more attention already for quite some years. I think we all just have to recently look back to January, the storming of the Capitol that culminated after years of growing domestic right-wing extremism in the US. One of the biggest threats to national security in the United Nations. You see also in several other countries said right-wing extremism. Some groups like Atom Weapon have affiliates in several countries, such as the UK, in Germany, and in Baltic states. Although the links between the different right-wing extremism groups is mainly through the internet and is not so much operational, I mean, they do seek each other out through the internet to further their agendas. And occasionally, we also see that there are certain right-wing groups that train together, for example, in Russia and Ukraine. So in particular, this transnational aspect of right-wing extremism and the ability to further each other's agenda, and it is a growing concern you see in several countries. You also see there's a link with the rise of right-wing populist governments, and drawing a distinction between when it is considered freedom of expression and when it is considered a violation. So the second aspect that I wanted to briefly mention is the changing nature of armed conflict. We've seen in the last couple of decades that in particular in the Middle East and in West Africa, the terrorist groups are involved more and more in armed conflicts. And when these terrorist groups are listed by the UN, the EU, or at national level as a terrorist group, this significantly impacts how to deal and address with terrorist groups. Just to give you an example, if a terrorist group has been designated, I should say a non-state armed group has been designated as a terrorist group, it doesn't allow them to join peace talks, and that would exclude them from potentially DDR programs, which also focus on reducing the arms. So this is something, it's posing significant problems. We've also seen this recently in Yemen, when under President Trump, the Houthis were designated as a terrorist group, and later on this was changed by the Biden administration. What we see is that some of these terrorist groups, like more recently, like US, ISIS is starting to use insurgent tactics, but we also see it the other way around, that traditional insurgent groups like Al-Shabaab are using more terrorist tactics. So distinguishing between terrorist groups which are involved in conflicts and from insurgent groups is becoming more and more difficult. So during a conflict, international humanitarian law is applicable, and it's applicable to both parties, to the state, but also to the non-state armed groups, which could include designated terrorist groups. So IHL prohibits acts of terrorism, yet not all acts of violence is prohibited under IHL. And this is where the distinction between IHL and the law which is applicable to terrorist groups can create tensions. So Another development, what we see is, the rise of anti-government and conspiracy thinkers. We see in several countries strong anti-government sentiment. Online conspiracy thinkers have provoked violence against the government, and this includes like the 5G attacks in the UK. I think it's up to even 70 attacks which have occurred there related to 5G. Also in the Netherlands, we've seen this, and in the US. Other examples include windmill attacks or even violence perpetrated against corona vaccination centers. So these are no longer political activists because they don't stay within the confines of the law, but they resort to violence. And it can be seen as political violence. What is complicated is whether this actually amounts to terrorism. And that is quite difficult to assess. But sometimes far-right groups, it could also be left groups, but we have seen so far only examples of far-right groups. They infiltrate and they sit between the intersection of conspiracy theory and political ideology, especially on online forums. And then it becomes very difficult to make a distinction whether we are talking just merely about political violence or whether this could amount to terrorism. But still, the biggest threat still is posed by jihad terrorism. So ISIS globally, as all of you know, has territorially been defeated 2 years ago. But ISIS as a brand, as a terrorist organization, is not defeated and still poses a threat. And ISIS is no longer strongly centrally organized, and you see the rise of regional affiliates with their own agenda, where they exploit local grievances and carry out attacks. Now, this is noticeable both in the Sahel, but also in the Horn in Africa. Just last week, there were a terrorist attack in Mozambique. And earlier last month, the US, in fact, designated the ISIS affiliates in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Mozambique as a terrorist organization. We also still see that ISIS continues to inspire and radicalize individuals. Recent examples include the Vienna attack last year in November. And although it was anticipated, we have the feeling that ISIS has not been able to capitalize on the pandemic and carry out large-scale attacks. But what we do see is that the risk of online radicalization has increased. If you look at ISIS more in Syria, there you see that the threat emanating from ISIS in Syria is still significant. So the large number of ISIS members detained in prisons and camps by the SDF pose a threat to the region, but also to other countries. And what we also see is that ISIS operates more as an insurgency there, and it still remains a force to reckon with. In the last couple of months, since 2021, we have seen a significant number of attacks conducted by ISIS in the SDF camps and outside, leading to multiple murders and deaths. So we continuously see that ISIS also locally poses a threat. And if you look at the numbers which are detained both in our whole camps, it's up to 64,000 persons are still detained in the camp, out of which 50% is Iraqi nationality and 30% is Syrian nationality, and 15% are foreigners. So this in January alone, over 100 attacks were carried out by ISIS. So from that perspective, we really see that ISIS in Syria still poses a threat, but also the foreigners which are detained are and remain a concern. As all of you know, most of the European countries are still very reluctant to repatriate their foreign terrorist fighters and their families. And the options are very limited to hold them accountable for the crimes they have committed locally. So, as you know, both in Syria and Iraq, it is hardly, feasible to think that they will be able to get a fair trial there. The Kurdish authorities are officially not a recognized state, but they have started local prosecutions, but they are only prosecuting local people. They are not prosecuting the foreign fighters. So it is important that risk assessments are conducted to distinguish those who are in the camps, which are merely victims, and those who really do potentially pose a risk to national security. So I think it was around last year in July when word came out that a lot of DNA tests were being conducted among the people who were detained in the camps, but it was not clear for which purposes this DNA sampling was taking place. So many countries are exploring the use of battlefield evidence to see whether this would allow them to successfully prosecute foreign terrorist fighters. In the last couple of years, we've seen that several at international, but also at national and regional level, that different organizations have been developing guidelines on how battlefield evidence can be used. I should actually say battlefield information can be used as evidence in court. So to give you a few examples, so what kind of information can be found which could potentially be used as evidence in court? These include documents like membership cards or transfer of property, but we also see fingerprints from unexploded IEDs that can be used, information contained in phones, computers, and occasionally even witness statements. So the challenges which lie here are how this information can properly be collected, stored, exploited, and then made available to law enforcement and prosecutors in a way that it is admissible as evidence in court. So like Paula mentioned, I was engaged as senior consultant for the UN, and they have developed UN guidelines on the use of battlefield evidence. But we have also seen that other agencies like Eurojust, but also the Council of Europe are working on guidelines, but also the NATO has adopted guidelines on the use of battlefield evidence. Those guidelines are not publicly available, so I cannot comment on the content of it, but it's just another example to illustrate that at several levels, efforts are being made to secure information from the battlefield so it can be used as evidence in court to address the potential threats that foreign terrorist fighters pose to their home countries. So looking at the time, I've passed the 10 minutes a little bit, so I would like to leave it at this for now. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them later on. So I'll give the floor back to you, Paula. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for these very pertinent introduction into the threats that we still see from terrorism, and on the especially interesting issue that we see with battlefield evidence. And I'm sure we will get back to you on this. But for now, I'd like to welcome Jack Watling to the stage.
Thank you very much. Am I coming through loud and clear? Yes, great. Okay. So that was a really useful, I think, introduction to the kind of threat landscape from the previous presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy challenges that are thrown up by the shifting focus that NATO now has. And I have to distinguish here between NATO as an institution, which does quite a lot of institutional activity and has its own relationships as an institution, versus the policy and military behavior of NATO members. Sometimes that is run through NATO, sometimes it's not. But these two things can both occur in the same operating environment and therefore often interact. And I suppose that the challenge that we face is that through the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, there was a methodology that was developed for countering terrorism, which was largely focused on the use of kinetic response to essentially oppose a mutually hurting stalemate on terrorist groups, and then a sustained effort at reconciliation agreements between terrorist groups and the governments with which they were in conflict, combined with large-scale stabilization efforts, use of aid, and sort of external assistance. Did I suddenly just lose? Did I not stop coming through there? I went muted for some reason.
I did that. Sorry, I wanted to mute myself.
Okay. At what point did I cut out?
I think if you just repeat your last sentence, it should be fine.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yeah. So what we've seen, I think, is that the use of terrorism or trying to counter terrorism has been in this kind of major state support to partner forces combined with institutional capacity building. That was essentially the methodology for stabilization and for conflict resolution. And that framework and methodology has largely fallen apart. The reason it has fallen apart, I would say, is twofold. The first is that the failure to achieve those ends in both Iraq and Afghanistan has led to states being quite reluctant to invest heavily in nation building. And therefore, the amount to which states are prepared to commit to supporting institutional capacity building has diminished. The second reason is that as we have had this shift back towards great power competition, a lot of our aid and development and capacity building effort has become an economy of effort, sort of economy of force and economy of resource effort. So we don't want to essentially commit so much resource to those activities that we are unable to deter great power rivals. But because we don't have a new methodology for conflict resolution, the language, the strategies, the framework for how we resolve conflicts hasn't actually been updated or changed. And so what we've seen is a divergence between our military practice and the strategy statements that come out of organizations like NATO and NATO members. On the one hand, the strategy statements are very focused on institutional capacity building, and we see relationships like training the officer corps through the staff college in Iraq. And at the same time, the actual military posture that we have is too small to realistically stabilize the operating environment, but allows us to conduct a sustained campaign of essentially targeted killing against terrorist groups in the operating environment. And not all member states of NATO pursue that, but lots of them feed into it, even if they're not leading it. And so that is essentially the effective output of our policy. We are whacking terrorists, whether through air power or the use of special forces, across a wide part of the world. But this sets up a really problematic dynamic, because historically, we have sought to reconcile terrorist groups with the governments that they are protesting against. And as the previous presentation, I think, highlighted very clearly, there is this dichotomy between terrorists with an international focus who are within or using local movements and insurgencies as protection and shelter, versus those local terrorist groups, often employing terrorist tactics, but where they essentially have local political demands. And the challenge we face is that while the states we are working with could potentially come up with functioning, working sort of processes to develop a peace process with some of these local groups, what that would lead to is concessions and to accommodation and to stabilization to some extent, but an environment from which those internationally focused terrorist organizations would be able to conduct attacks. And so, ironically, while our strategy is one that says we're aiming at stabilization, our military practice is one that aims to harass those international terrorist groups sufficiently that they are too distracted, too threatened to be able to plan and conduct attacks against us. But in doing so, we are actually maintaining instability. And so that's why, for example, if you look at Mali and the Sahel, even though the number of forces committed from NATO members has increased over the last decade, stabilization has reversed across much of that area. There has been a systematic, disjointed kind of mismatch between the counter-terrorism strategy and the development strategy. And if anything, my concern is that great power competition is going to make that worse rather than better, because for two reasons. Firstly, the resources we have available to commit to these problems is less. But secondly, because we are now in competition with other actors, it means that any state that puts itself forward to own a problem, let's say, just hypothetically, the British government were to say, we are going to lead on trying to resolve the crisis in Yemen, we're going to put in significant resources, we're potentially going to look at peacekeeping missions. We're potentially going to look at using some of our assets to kind of force people to the negotiating table. If we were to very publicly own that problem, there would be a very significant incentive for Iran, potentially for Russia, to continue to destabilize the environment in order to fix British resources into Yemen. We're already seeing that in Syria, where if you look under the Trump administration, some US officials spoke quite openly about fixing the Russians in Syria and causing persistent attrition against them in order to prevent them from being able to use that resource elsewhere. I'm not saying that that is US policy, but it was certainly something that Trump-era officials spoke about quite openly. And so what you end up with is a dynamic where, because it is easier to destabilize an environment than to stabilize it, it is very, very risky for any government to actually own the idea of stabilizing these states. And so what I think we need as NATO is a re-articulation of our strategy and approach. We need to recognize that the resource that underpins and makes possible the historical methodologies that we've adopted is no longer available. And so some of those methodologies are no longer ones that are realistically things we can do. But secondly, there may be a need to admit to our public that in the long term, it is worth accepting that there will be some terrorist attacks generated from these areas, because longer term stability in these places is something that's worth having. And therefore, we need to allow local groups to start coming to accommodations with governments and to be able to support stabilization over the longer term. But that means an acceptance of risk, and risk that may well play out in our capital cities rather than in theirs. And so, that requires political leadership. It requires a very frank conversation with our publics about the guarantees we can make. If we do not have that shift in focus, then my concern is that while we intend to reduce our footprint in large parts of the world in order to focus on great power competition, the reality is we will increasingly find ourselves fixed and drawn into essentially a targeted killing process across more and more geographical areas, partly because the terrorists themselves are disseminating and latching onto insurgencies in new areas, but also because threats like climate change and other systemic issues are actually causing instability to spread. And so some of the challenges that give harbour and safe haven an opportunity for these international terrorist groups to interact with local actors are becoming ones that are available in more areas of the world. So really, the problem here is that NATO as an institution cannot drive that realignment of strategy, because it is a consensus organization that implements the strategy agreed upon by its members. Which means that if we are going to have that conversation about burden sharing, about what we can realistically offer, about what the realistic end states are, and about where we accept risk, and that is the thing we're often very bad at articulating among ourselves, that needs to be driven by member state governments going to NATO and saying, while we have this taxonomy and language and these programs, they are no longer consistent with the resource and effort that we're willing to put into it, and therefore we need to have a rethink, which requires leadership. And I suppose the question there is counterterrorism something that our national governments want to continue to publicly show leadership on, or is that somewhere where they do not want to invest their political capital? Because if they're not prepared to have that conversation, then I fear there will continue to be a divergence between our stated strategy and our actual practice. And with that, I believe I'm on the mark of 10 minutes, so I will hand back to the chair.
Thank you very much for those insights. I think it's very interesting to point out this divergence between what we say and what we actually do. And I'm certain that we will come back to this. But now I would like to hand over to Kenneth.
And here I am, I hope. Just a test. Excellent. I see a thumbs up. Yes, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Watling, for that very interesting previous exposition, which quite beautifully fits with what I'm about to say, indeed, about NATO counterterrorism, as we speak about it in terms of, well, I'll be talking more about the strategic macro perspective view on how NATO is approaching counterterrorism in the last decade, basically. And the fact is that, of course, NATO is perhaps in somewhat of a problem when it comes to counterterrorism, because, of course, it is a military alliance, and it can only do things which are, in essence, have a military relevance, of course. And in that terms, of course, when we speak about the grand strategy about terrorism, we have a bit of a problem because, well, NATO's, as a military organization, would be at the sharp end of counterterrorism, whereas in an ideal world, we would want the sharp end to be used only as a last resort, and preferably we'd try and make sure that we don't need it at all. Which of course puts NATO a bit in a difficult position when it tries to play a role of some relevance in the global counterterrorism effort and whatever counterterrorism effort the alliance wishes to pursue. But nonetheless, I mean, so there have been successes and there have also been failures, of course. I mean, we all know that NATO was plugged into the United States global war on terror, at least as it turns joining the coalition or at least some member states joining the coalition to go in Afghanistan, whereas opting not to intervene in Iraq. And unfortunately, the communist opinion has been that both operations have been strategic failures. This is not my opinion, but it tends to be the opinion of the international academic community, at least. So the fact is that is not much of a success story, but nonetheless, at least we make an overall evaluation. Yes, it's true. Al-Qaeda is still around. Its comeback might just simply have been delayed by the ongoing pandemic. And ISIS is also far from defeated. It is we only have to follow the situation in Mozambique to know what's going on over there, and that they're actually trying to come back on the rise. And that is when we haven't spoken of future perspectives and the consequences of the damage that will be done by the global measures to fight COVID and all the economic crisis and the ensuing extremism that will follow from there. So the problem is that indeed there have been successes. But there also have, in terms of general success, there isn't exactly that much. Of course, the fact is that NATO does have devoted some thought to counterterrorism policy, and in 2012, I believe it has already been referred to, there have been these policy guidelines in which has defined the three most pertinent areas in which NATO can indeed offer some sort of contribution to the counterterrorism effort. And these three areas focus on awareness, mainly talking about intelligence, information sharing, leveraging the fact that the alliance has so many member states and also so many partner nations that they can speak about, or at least try and get some sort of raising awareness and intelligence sharing effort going on. The second is indeed capacity building, which has so nicely been explained by my predecessor, which also includes effectively mainly the operations in theater, but also helping host nations, for example, to build up their capabilities to make sure that they can prevent terrorism, that they can detect terrorism, and that they can make their host nation less hospitable to terrorist groups. And the third would be in terms of engagement, indeed, speaking not only intra-alliance engagement, but also with the partner countries, which has actually managed to unite 69 nations in something of a common goal around counterterrorism and a common view on what that goal should be and what kind of counterterrorism that they can pursue. This is 69 nations, including, of course, the 28 that are in the alliance. Now, in terms of if you look at that, of course, there is a difference between how this all goes in practice and how this is all has been communicated by NATO. Because if you look at the official NATO rhetoric, what I call the NATO rhetoric, its communications policy on counterterrorism, you see a lot about conducting consultations. Yes, okay, with the final goal of this counterterrorism policy of NATO, logically, to be to push back the geographic boundary of of terrorism beyond alliance territory, and in so doing, contributing to an overall counterterrorism effort. But that is, of course, where these matters are perhaps a little bit difficult for NATO to reconcile all these goals, and indeed the rather limited role that NATO as an alliance can play in this. Now, my predecessor has brilliantly explained, indeed, the what NATO always does best, of course, which is operations in theater as a military organization. Naturally, they have, I think that the most successes have been made in terms of devising explanations, responses to these requirements against asymmetric threats, how the use of kinetic force, the utility of the use of force, target hardening, intelligence and surveillance, the human cultural awareness and sensitivity, so as not to create further discontent. A lot about improvised explosive devices detection and destruction, and of course a lot of route clearance, which was naturally very important. I'm speaking especially as an intelligence expert. For me, counterterrorism, well, terrorism is a tool, therefore counterterrorism is also a tool. And, well, NATO's relevance can be to actually offer a number of things within that toolbox. Based on what NATO does best. And of course, when we speak again about this capability building, education, training, and the conduct of exercises within the alliance, and again with partner nations, especially host nations. Again, that's where NATO also has a great relevant role. And of course, naturally, I will be telling you that in terms of raising the awareness matter, intelligence, the information sharing is indeed what possibly has the greatest potential for NATO to be a great success story. In terms of indeed not only, once again, speaking with other international organizations, just cooperating with the UN, who also has a counterterrorism policy, but also with the EU and signing into certain EU projects, or at least combining that, or at least the EU intelligence sharing and information sharing bodies, in which what the European NATO member states also have a great deal of relevance to offer in that regard. Now, certainly, NATO can not only enhance cooperation within its own body, but also, therefore, outside of it. But that, of course, brings us to, indeed, again, this has been referred to in the previous presentation, that there is great potential for NATO to play an evolving and increasing role in counterterrorism based on what NATO's been doing so far, especially in terms of a kinetic response. But, well, we have to move past the fact of consultations and the rhetoric and the PR communications part and go into political action. And that is unfortunately where things tend to block, of course, which is based greatly on the fact that, well, certain member states have very different perceptions about what the terrorist threat actually is and what kind of counterterrorism policy they should pursue, which, of course, completely taps into the fact that counterterrorism and security policy is still a national national competence and something that NATO, as a consensus body, as my colleague indeed referred to, has difficulty when there is no consensus. There is nothing to be discussed about, and the problem is that indeed we'll have to get past that in some way. There is a great deal of will. There is a great deal of commitment within those working in NATO to actually get things done. But we tend to find that at a political level, this tends to stop or at least get mired into certain discussions, right? And this is leaving me with the last minute, indeed, in which the point is that the role of NATO can be in leveraging its resources. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of intelligence sharing. I've never met a SACEUR who is happy about the intelligence sharing arrangement within NATO, which is one of the benefits of being a Belgian academic, that I get more chances than most to speak to high-level NATO personnel about this. indeed improving its capacity, but also the fact that NATO can play a role in not coercive, but perhaps more compelling diplomacy and indeed aid, turning money into its main weapon system by and also engaging defense forces in this to get host states to stop being so hospitable to terrorist nations, or at least allow them to stop this. And that's the fact, that is regarding to the problem of the political issues, the fact, of course, in international relations, which I hope that we'll get back to, indeed. So a lot of potential, but a need for a lot of political action in the first place as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights, and especially emphasizing the importance of intelligence sharing, which is certainly something that is really crucial for NATO and will possibly get better at. And sticking a bit with the theme of intelligence and social media, now it's Marie's turn.
Thank you, Paula. Hello, everyone. I hope that you are enjoying a wonderful conference, as I do. And thank you all previous speakers for valuable inputs. My name is Marie Zametsnikova, as you may see below. And I would like to contribute to this panel with an insight to counterterrorism and social media. Social media channels are more or less 2 decades old. Yet it is no overstatement to say that they have already reshaped many aspects of modern life. No early medium combined such a vast audience with social media's personalized experience, tailored by sophisticated algorithms to each user's interests. Social media influence and even drive world events. United States presidential elections can be one of many examples. But you can also reach audience despite a lower budget via social media tools with micro-targeted personalized messages. I would like to give you an example. NATO plays an active role in counter-terrorism activities on all social media platforms and developed also its powerful presence. Do you know that, for example, its Instagram account is rising by 1,000 followers in less than 1 month? All of these followers then consume information that is published on that platform. Or, for example, the hashtag that this conference is also using, We Are NATO, for spreading the message that we are part of NATO and that we are here. We are part of the community. But there is also more behind it than only a hashtag. It has an aim to resonate among young audience. This campaign conveys that NATO allied work and train together to keep citizens safe. This can we can also interpret this digital language hashtag into a brand of spreading package reliability, vision of better world and mutual trust. Unfortunately, terrorists has also adopted new technologies to their purposes in similar manner as, for example, NATO does, but in negative connotation. And social media is no exception. Indeed, social media has proved particularly well suited for terrorist propagandizing and recruiting for several reasons. First, social media enables terrorists to communicate radicalizing messages to a far wider cycle of potential adherents than they could have reached with traditional media. Unlike websites, these services are free, user-friendly, and most can be used pseudonymously, such as nicknames and fake identity. Put simply, social media allows terrorists to recruit and propagize across borders in a way that 20th century technology never allowed. Another advantage of social media for terrorists is that they can engage directly and publicly with more credible figures and hijacking those figures' visibility to amplify terrorists' own messages. It can be, for example, replying first to someone's tweet or harassing these figures to gain like-minded users. But while social media offers terrorists valuable capabilities, it also brings vulnerabilities. This can lead us to a question: does information age and even social media provide an added value to NATO in terms of counterterrorism? We can take an example of Church Christ in New Zealand 2019, when the terrorist attacks was a live stream massacre that authorized could have looked like a surrealistic war simulation, and nobody could watch it around the world. And the power of social media channels is that when you publish something on one channel, it can easily be republished on other platforms. like a chain viral reaction that cannot be controlled. Of course, this tragic situation should not be placed on social channels, as there are many civilians who are vulnerable, such as children, for example, and it can have much worse than negative connotation at the end. However, there is still an opportunity to use that content by military groups, such as NATO, to chase terrorist groups and their networks in order to protect civilians in the future. As we may suggest from the phrase social network, it provides us with a detailed map of who is linked to whom in a given organization of movement, which is a basic task of intelligent analysis seeking to understand a terrorist group. We can also link it to an example of our private social media channels. For example, if you have Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, you have your friends, your followers, and everybody can see who follows you and who you follow. And this is a really valuable insight into NATO and other organizations. So how can we assure that civilians are protected on both battlefields? I mean, in a physical and a virtual world. Physical is that we develop counter-terrorist policy to avoid physical attacks in the future. And in the same time, we use the digital information without exposing civilians to face such brutal content. For example, information in the post can help NATO's intelligence agencies and other analysts to locate individual terrorists, observe how terrorist group operates, for example, in Syria or Afghanistan, and learn how foreign fighters traveled. Also, direct messages sent on social media platforms are vulnerable to surveillance by Western officials, leading terrorist groups to shift most of their communications to encrypted platforms. Even where the technological challenges can be surmounted, any intervention to address terrorist use can have a collateral effect on other important values: cybersecurity, freedom of speech, economic dynamism, and human rights. Some social media channels such as Facebook, Google, YouTube, or even Twitter have expanded their moderation teams and sharpened their guidance as to what is the extremes content, by also developing tools driven by artificial intelligence that can ultimately enable platforms to identify and remove terrorist content faster than its creators can put it up. Artificial able to make the foreseeable future. So I would like to close my input here and give back the floor to Paula. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie, for your inputs and for showing especially also the role that social media is increasingly playing in counterterrorism and how NATO has to take that into account. I think what we have seen from all of these presentations so far is that counterterrorism is a very wide field and that there's many, especially also new and emerging challenges that NATO has to face, whether that is in the field of policy, intelligence sharing, or social media. I would like to open this now for a Q&A. And we will start with the first question that we have been getting. And this would be for Tanya. Tanya, you have done a lot on battlefield evidence. And what would be interesting to hear is evidence that is collected by the military already widely accepted in courts? And which role should it play in this regard?
Hi, thank you, Paula. I hope you can hear me. I'm having a lot of problems with the internet, or maybe it's just on my end. But thanks for the question. Yes, it has already been used in a couple of court cases. In the UK, for example, a famous case, the Sardar case, a taxi driver who was held up at the airport and his fingerprints matched. It was in a database which had been collected several years earlier by Americans in Iraq during a regular surveillance. So yes, there are examples of battlefield evidence that is starting to be used in court, but it does pose certain challenges. First of all, in some countries, the laws needs to be amended to allow battlefield evidence to be introduced as evidence in court. And one has to be careful when using battlefield evidence in court that the defense has the right to be able to challenge the defense, which is the evidence which is put forward against him. And the problem is here that when the information collected from the battlefield is indeed intelligence, it becomes problematic because then it may not always be shared. So there are certain concerns with the use of battlefield evidence, and this is also the reason why guidance is being developed. So these are issues which are really to be dealt with from a legal perspective in a courtroom, but there are also obviously challenges completely at the beginning of collecting evidence. If you would have military which are not properly trained, and they need to know how to secure a crime scene, and the evidence should not be contaminated, otherwise the chain of custody would be broken. So there are different layers in which attention needs to be given to be able to allow information collected from the battlefield to be used as evidence.
Thank you very much for those insights, and maybe just staying with you for a second, because I know that you have to leave a bit earlier than the rest of us. What would you say, should militaries whose primary role is to fight actually be saddled with more of these responsibilities where they have to go around the battlefield and then actually also collect evidence? And maybe connected to that, does it take a lot of time for them to prepare for this task, and do they need to be trained in this? And how much work and effort would that be? Tanya, can you hear me?
I could only hear the first part. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. I could only hear the first part, not the second part. It's a good question. I personally think, it is not the primary role of the military, neither should it be. I really consider it the exception. So you have to look at it from a different perspective. I mean, normally you would send out a request for mutual legal assistance, and then the prosecutor and he would go to that specific area and collect the evidence that is needed. We are working in circumstances where either there is no mutual legal assistance agreement, or the country is a conflict-torn country where it would not be possible to physically go to that area to collect the evidence. So in those exceptional cases, so it is certainly not meant to become the rule, it should remain the exception, one could consider to see if the military can play a role. And I think a lot has changed over the years. The military are already collecting a lot of the information for military purposes. So the question then is, if you're already collecting it for military purposes, whether or not certain information can be declassified and be made available for law enforcement purposes. But I'm sure some of my colleagues in the panel might have a view on this as well. But it would require indeed some training, and there are several different methods. One could also have like an evidence custodian traveling, be embedded with the police, or you could have forensic specialists or forensic mobile equipment. So there are different ways of looking at it and how it could be accommodated within a rule of law framework.
Jack or Kenneth, do you want to come in on this and on the task whether the military should focus on battlefield evidence tasks or whether or not?
I can speak brief and just say that I think while the military has been able to do this, especially when we're talking about special forces units that are conducting exploitation of materials collected after a strike, it will always be unless the specific purpose of a mission is to seize someone to bring them to trial, a secondary consideration. And it does require a pretty high level of training and assurance to be able to make sure that the evidence is usable. And so when it is possible, we can absolutely use that material, and that's a good thing. I think we have to be realistic about our expectations in terms of the scale and reliability with which the military will be able to come up with usable intelligence and usable evidence, noting that those two things are often different and difficult to reconcile. So, you can train people to do it, but there are a huge number of variables in a combat zone that you don't control and which can invalidate a lot of those materials. And so unless evidence is the purpose of the mission, then you can't necessarily expect to get back usable material.
Thank you, Jack, for his insights. And maybe staying with realistic expectations, that is actually something that links quite well to what you have been saying before, which is mainly that we have to communicate better which end states, when NATO is involved in counterterrorism, are actually manageable and doable. And I wanted to ask if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on that point, how we should communicate this and how such end states could look like.
So it's very context specific. But if we look at, for example, Fulani insurgency in the Sahel, it is entirely realistic that the government of Mali and of Chad and of Burkina Faso could come up with propositions to the Fulani community that would settle down a lot of the insurgency. That could be assisted in great part by the application of aid and by the use of money to stimulate some of the goodwill that might be necessary. But if you do that, then there has been a growing relationship between Al-Qaeda and those local insurgent groups for about 6 years now. There's a certain amount of personal relationships involved. And if you are going to broker that kind of local agreement, then you are going to have a large swathe of the Sahel in which it will be difficult to conduct kinetic strikes against Al-Qaeda, and therefore Al-Qaeda will use it as a safe haven, because you can't make peace with a community and then kick down doors in the middle of that community in the night. It just doesn't work that way. And so, we face a choice. We can either say that the stabilization of the Sahel in order to reduce the, migration and displacement into Europe and to reduce a number of other threats is worth the risk of giving Al-Qaeda a relative safe haven. Or we can say that no, the prospect of attacks on our cities is too great, and therefore we are going to continue to chase down Al-Qaeda members at the price of continuing to destabilize the center of those countries and continuing to see a large amount of population displacement. And it's very difficult to square that circle, or at least in order to come to to resolve both of those challenges, you're talking quite long timeframes, realistically, in which in the medium term, you are going to have to accept risk on one of those axes. And so being honest with our public about which threat we are prioritizing and why is, I think, a critical component of having public support behind our policy, and therefore being able to invest in it at sufficient scale to give it a chance of succeeding. Because you can write very fine strategies, but if you dribble in your resources in piecemeal bits and pieces, then you won't hit a critical mass where you have enough influence on the ground to actually achieve very much. And this is something that a lot of NATO specific, as in NATO-led organizational programs, run into. I brought up the example of training the officer corps in Iraq before. It's a very good program to train officers in the staff college, but when those officers meet an operating environment and political masters who have quite specific demands that are incompatible with the NATO training, unsurprisingly, and I don't think we could expect anything else, they follow the demands of their political masters and of the political context within which they're operating, which leads to some of those officers being involved in shooting protesters, for example. And NATO has a very limited capacity unless people are really going to grapple with the wider environment to prevent that from happening. And so what you end up with is a well-intentioned program that doesn't necessarily have the effects that you would like, because it is working without sufficient foundations around it to succeed.
I see. Thank you for pointing out that difficulty. There's also been a question that asked that you talked a bit about great power rivalry and how other actors could try and log people down into more protracted wars. How do you think that NATO could prevent Chinese and Russian interference, for example, in this regard?
I don't think that they will make a calculation about whether it's in their interests, and they will make a calculation as to whether it costs them anything. NATO and whether they particularly are concerned about second order consequences of continuing to destabilize a particular area. NATO can collectively use deterrence or punish or expose how that is being done, and therefore inflict diplomatic cost. Using some of those ISR assets that were mentioned, to essentially increase the risk of states engaging in that kind of behavior. But ultimately, if we are in a competitive multipolar environment, then those states will make a decision that's based on their interests, and you can shape the calculus, but you can't determine the outcome. And so there is a serious question there around deterrence, and around what NATO is prepared to do against great powers that are threatening its operations and relationships indirectly, because that clearly isn't an Article 4 or Article 5 issue. So there aren't really very good mechanisms within the alliance to treat those activities as things that the alliance can respond to. But that doesn't mean that there can't be a deterrent strategy and a discussion between members about what levers they can use elsewhere to impose a cost on that activity. And then there's a question of how do you message that so that the other side understands that it needs to factor those costs into what it might be doing. It may well be the case that a lot of that activity is not done through NATO, but done by NATO members, because it's using their ISR assets anyway. And NATO as an alliance might find it much easier to have consensus on its central mission in Europe of deterrence against great power conflict.
Thank you very much. We've also been getting a question which I think Kenneth and Marie are the best people to answer. The question reads as the following. As tech companies like Facebook delete more information on terrorism off the internet, do organizations like NATO, who rely heavily on open source intelligence, run into the danger of losing important intelligence? If so, what could you consider as viable ways to ensure that the society is on the one hand kept safe from propaganda, while also giving the military enough insight to do its job? So essentially, open source intelligence, how NATO uses it, and whether there is a difficulty when private social media platforms delete information off of it.
Thank you, Paula, for a wonderful question and a tough one. But I would just keep it simple, and it's international cooperation mainly. So international cooperation can be effective only if similar standards are adopted and implemented worldwide. This is what should drive all nations, that together we are better and stronger than alone. So this is, for example, the CTRC, which was launched in 2020 and recently implemented. And there needs to be also technical assistance to translate international standards into regional and bilateral regulations. Also, there is an input that agenda shouldn't be only on table, but there should be action implemented by international community. And when we speak about international community and technologies, the blockchain technology is one of the most advanced technologies that we have, and that can be implemented for that reason. With blockchain technology is a system of recording information in a way that makes it difficult or impossible to change, hack or cheat the system, which also leads us to data, because data are really important today. For example, 2017 WannaCry or NotPetya, which affected in more than 150 countries with around $300 million loss and reputation damage and a lot of loss of data. So how we can what we can do with that, and it's an AI solution, probably artificial intelligence, that we should be ahead. In nowadays world, it is always about preparation, especially in cyberspace and digitalization overall. You can imagine an army of terrorist robots driven by artificial intelligence, but no country can succeed in this alone. We need intelligence, we need experts, we need scholars such as COE, such as SPS, LL, STO. The attention should be also paid to the use of virtual assets, the exploitation of new technologies, and the use of social media to raise awareness among public and among young people, because the social media are also the majority of social media users is young audience. So to spread awareness about this, and yeah, I would answer by this.
Okay, Kenna?
Yes, I can second what Marie's been saying, indeed. But the fact is, of course, that one has to ask a question what the actual intelligence value is of most of the complete nonsense which is being posted online. There is a big difference between rhetoric and between actual indications of intent or stuff that can be turned into actionable intelligence. That is one consideration. The other consideration is that, yes, it's true, social media platforms are getting a lot better at quickly detecting this sort of propaganda and removing it. But data is never really completely removed. So there will have been some time in which it will have been present on the internet or in the sphere, whatever you wish to call it. And it's true, as Marie has been saying, there are a great deal of companies and a lot of research institutes which are working very hard on creating all sorts of technical OSINT solutions, which are very much specialized in detecting this sort of language. Natural language processing abilities actually is what it's called, in detecting, for one, this sort of radicalizing propaganda. And there is also some work being done, some limited progress, of course, being made with indeed deep learning applications that can actually predict when language turns into planning or leakage behavior or actual intent or actually building up the capacity to engage in actual terrorist attacks or planned terrorist attacks, and so that is so there's certainly being progress being made in that regard. But one other third consideration, and that's what I'll finish with, is also that as these mainstream social media platforms are getting a lot better at removing this sort of content, this also means that these radicalized groups, as we have seen, are increasingly just shifting towards other platforms where they can freely spew whatever stuff that they actually say, and that in itself is perhaps again not a good development, but for OSINT purposes it might be, because it allows us to target where to look. I mean, it's better to look over there than in vastness of Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. But on the other hand, of course, it creates an even more resonating echo chamber for this sort of propaganda. So the ones who are actually in it only get further radicalized, and that is not a good thing. So the fact is that, yes, we have to shut them down, and ideally make sure that nobody gets on it, so that and purpose of that, for intelligence purposes, that might not be very good. But well, there are other tools in the toolbox.
That is certainly true. I think Marie has a short comment on what you just said.
Yes, I totally agree with you, Kenneth. I just want to add that, as we may know, the counterterrorism is being slowly but surely privatized. On the one hand, we have main technology companies such as Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and others, which use artificial technology and artificial intelligence to do image and language matching. On the other hand, there is NATO, who also have its capacities in terms of counterterrorism, and that there were already mentioned. There is still a huge barrier of two different dimensions, like black and white, that if experts from these two entities, which I mean, for example, NATO and social media companies would cooperate closely together from the point of expertise, then there can be developed OSINT 2.0, aka Open Source Intelligence 2.0, which I think can be a really interesting point.
Thank you very much. Tanya, I know that you have to leave very soon. So sticking with this topic on social media and open source intelligence, I wanted to ask, how does this play into the evidence? So when militaries and private initiatives like Bellingcat rely a lot on open source intelligence and pictures posted on social media as well as propaganda, what are the difficulties in admitting such kind of evidence in court? And does international law adapt to these changes?
Thank you very much, Paula. Yeah, so once you start looking at indeed electronic evidence, or I mean information on social media, and to look whether or not it can be used as evidence in court, there are also a lot of platforms at the moment in which law enforcement and prosecutors work closely together with tech companies together. But to be able to use it as evidence, one needs to make sure that the evidence is authentic, and you have to see to it, look at the integrity. So the main concerns is that is there an ability that someone or something has tampered with the evidence before it can be used as evidence. So those are the concerns or some of the thresholds that needs to be met. But what is more complicated, yes, in one way you want to prevent people who are radicalizing to get on these platforms and that information will be removed. But sometimes that information is exactly the evidence a prosecutor would like to use. So removing it is not always then the solution. And the problem is that for prosecutors, they will have to send a request to, in most cases, it will be to the US, to request the internet providers to store the evidence for a certain amount of time, because they delete it after a certain amount of time. So they will need to send out a request, and that is quite time consuming. And there are several, initiatives trying to improve how to obtain electronic evidence better and faster so it can be used as evidence in court. Also at the EU level, there are some significant steps being taken to use that, improve that system.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. And I know that you will have to leave us now, which is very unfortunate, but thank you so much for taking the time to enlighten us all a bit on battlefield evidence and the role that NATO can play in it. I think it's a topic that isn't discussed very much in counterterrorism, but that is certainly an important role where the military should at least think about the role it wants to play there. So thank you really much.
Yeah, my pleasure, and it was nice being here, and I wish you success at the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Well, to the rest of you who are still here, there is actually we were talking about great power rivalry, and there's often China and Russia that is mentioned, but obviously there are also a lot of other actors such as Iran who are trying to get more influence, especially in the Middle Eastern region where there is still a bit of upheaval. And the integrated review that the UK government has recently published argues that state sponsorship of terrorism, the use of proxies, and the likelihood of successful CBRN attacks by 2030 will become quite an issue, and actually something that might happen. So how can or should NATO react to this?
So, I mean, we've seen several hundred chemical weapons attacks now in Syria. Not all of them higher-end agents, but some of them using nerve agents. And we've also seen attacks conducted by nation states on other nation states' territory, which has been an attempt at targeted killing, but has killed civilians. And so, the norms against the use of chemical weapons have eroded, and the fact that there are states that have, should we say, they're not particularly stable. Should we say they're not particularly stable? Manufacturing this stuff. Programs manufacturing this stuff means that there is a much higher risk that it gets out into the hands of militias or groups who might want to employ it for a range of means. The means for which it's been used in Syria has mainly been to clear civilians out of urban areas, to kind of remove the support structure around insurgents, to enable conventional attack. But obviously terrorists would have a great deal of use for this sort of technology, not least because of the psychological impact, the disproportionate psychological impact that contaminating an environment has, as compared to a bomb, which has an immediate effect, but not necessarily quite such a long-term one. So the risk is very high. And then the separate question about proxies, which is, higher end chemical weapons and those sorts of threats do essentially emanate from states. There are a couple of instances of non-state actors manufacturing them, but it is a pretty intense and complicated process. But the fact that there are states who are manufacturing these things and are using them means that, and wish to do so deniably in some cases, means that there are vectors for that to transfer across to proxies. So there's a strategic concern or a threat. That doesn't mean it will happen. The proxy issue is one that's very real and doesn't just apply to great powers. Iran, as you mentioned, but also, if we look at Libya, we have a NATO member, Turkey, sponsoring a certain number of groups in a very different direction to other members of the alliance. We have France with relationships with other actors who are in conflict. We have the UAE acting on the ground in support of some actors, and we have the Russians going in. And so there you have a real issue when you start dealing with proxies, and we've had the same issue in Syria, where there is actually very little alignment in interests or relationships between NATO members. And at that point, it becomes really hard to have an alliance position, or at least a constructive alliance policy on counterterrorism, because members may not even agree as to who the terrorists are. And in that sense, it really complicates the ability of the alliance to actually have a constructive policy, and especially to pursue that stabilization sort of language and framework that it has historically used. And so whenever those sorts of issues crop up, I think what you see is that NATO as an institution essentially says that's in the too difficult box, and we're going to focus on our core mission. And we will continue to facilitate dialogue behind the scenes on the other issues, but NATO institutionally is not going to be involved. We leave that to member states. But if there are more places where that happens, then the process that has been kind of snowballing since the fall of the Soviet Union, whereby you have more and more states becoming affiliated to NATO, probably slows down, because NATO's constructive role in a lot of these areas is diminished or curtailed.
Do you have any hopes that the strategic process that NATO is now currently embarking on will kind of deliver a threat assessment which makes more sense for more members, or where everyone is on the same page? Or do you think that it's more going to be this whack-a-mole approach again, where we just see what we can do and just kind of like try to muddle through?
I think there's a great deal of alignment in the alliance on some core questions. The threat posed by Russia is one that I think pretty much all members recognize, and some of the gaps and areas of divergence that have historically constrained our approach to Russia have narrowed. So France, which was strongly arguing for a southern focus for some time, is now reinvesting in divisional warfighting capabilities and is focused on the eastern question. And similarly, Turkey in Nagorno-Karabakh was assisting Azerbaijan fighting a state that Russia has guaranteed security to. So, there isn't necessarily a mismatch in outlook across the alliance on that question. But as we deal with counterterrorism, and the kind of mismatch between global counterterrorism against those international actors versus local insurgency, the great power dynamic and the competition dynamic both lead to a fracturing of interests. That means that NATO will struggle to provide that kind of coherent or cohesive function. And so what you're likely to see is bilateral collaboration between NATO members where there is alignment, not necessarily through the NATO structure. Although it's worth highlighting that that is enabled by the STANAG, the NATO standardization agreements that make those forces interoperable. So even though NATO may not provide the command and control infrastructure to support some of those operations, it does often provide the standardized kind of benchmark that allows those militaries to cooperate and its members to cooperate.
Well, thank you very much for your insights on this. I think something that I'd like to ask Kenneth, kind of in the end, is we have seen now this difficulty between, on the one hand, threats that we see coming from international terrorism, but then also the national responses that countries have to this. And I know that you've researched quite a lot on Belgium and how Belgium responded to it. And Belgium actually got the military involved after the attacks to kind of provide internal security. Do you think that this was a smart move, or do you think that taking on counterterrorism issues by the military in your domestic country could actually lead to depletion of forces and force capacity for NATO overall?
Yes, it was very much the latter, indeed. So I'm speaking to you from Brussels, where after 6 years, finally, the police is taking over from the soldiers in guarding public spaces. And before that, they were also guarding the streets. And yes, I mean, this delves right into the question of the difference between the use of force and the utility of force. Absolutely, it is not the core business of the military to do domestic policing. And it came with a tremendous array of all sorts of difficulties regarding the fact that you do not use the military as a police, not in Western democratic states, but of course, what are notions of democracy in pandemic measure eras. But aside from that, yes, it was very much an attritional problem for the Belgian army, which is not that very large to begin with, that a great deal of its capacity was certainly at the height of the threat, was being used to guard the Belgian streets and actually take over from the police, which was it's in itself suffering from a great deal of depletion, and was simply did not have the capacity to actually take on this particular threat. In which regard it was acceptable that you do this for a brief period of time while you're working on capacity building in police, and also actually training the police in having the necessary counterinsurgency, counter-terrorist skills when you're dealing with such determined attackers as we've had the Daesh people, especially the foreign fighters who actually had certain training in which your friendly neighborhood policeman or policewoman isn't exactly equipped to deal with, as we have unfortunately had to experience in Liège when 2 female police officers were brutally killed by a radicalized individual, but not a foreign fighter. But yes, that is, it was a very bad move. I've always publicly condemned it. I always said that it was very counterproductive, especially for Belgian defense, which also meant that they had a great deal of trouble meeting whatever commitment they had made in NATO or other international operations that Belgium was taking part in. So the question of whether the military can play a role in domestic counterterrorism is one that's one that can. The condition that is very limited in time, when the need is the greatest. I mean, in London as well, right after the I think it was the Westminster attacks, the British Army also guarded the streets of London for 48 hours. Jack, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was 48 hours. Now that's acceptable indeed. That's when they said, okay, the threat is at its highest, and now we need to be able to actually deter or respond to it. And after 48 hours, they said, okay, fine, now the police can take over again. That's a good approach, but not for such a prolonged time. That's done tremendous damage to the Belgian army, also because you do not become a soldier to be put on the street without any competence to actually do anything. And we've also seen that a lot of people left the Belgian army because of that.
Well, thank you very much for those insights. And because we have 3 minutes left, I would ask each of you to take one of those minutes and to tell me what you would like to see for NATO's counterterrorism approach as it goes into the future. Marie, why don't you go first?
That's another tough question. What I would see in the future for counterterrorism in terms of NATO, I would say what I already mentioned. It would be the more international cooperation, because stronger we are, we are stronger together. So I would strengthen the cooperation internationally among all countries and cooperate on more than bilateral level. And I would say like this. And sorry.
No, that's perfectly fine. International cooperation is a crucial element, especially in counterterrorism. Kenneth, what would your wishes be for NATO's approach to counterterrorism in the future?
Well, I've already said it, of course. I mean, I say it in my classes as well on counterterrorism. 3 words: intelligence, intelligence, and intelligence. Better intelligence sharing arrangements in which these member states are able to put aside their sovereign and nationalist concerns, also their information sharing concerns, to actually allow NATO to fulfill a certain ambition of being a real hub of actionable intelligence, fusing it together, leveraging one another's capabilities, a lot more of that, and moving forward from that, actually to say something, to agree with what Marie's presentation was. I think in terms of information warfare, NATO also has great potential to fulfill that. I mean, terrorism is in the end a propaganda information warfare battle. So NATO can certainly play a tremendous role in that. And thirdly, my third wish would be that we look a great deal more into the positive coercive diplomacy aspect in terms of using money as a weapon system. But really, I mean, research has shown that whenever the military is involved in developmental aid operations, especially in these regions which we try to strengthen in terms of their own domestic situations, that has been a lot more effective than working than strictly separating the military aspect from the developmental aspect. I know that this is something that people in developmental studies or conflict studies don't like to hear, but the research shows otherwise. So I think that there might be something to explore there as well.
Thank you. And Jack, the last word is yours.
Very briefly. I think that the key thing for me is that counterterrorism is increasingly becoming something that's awkward to discuss, and that politicians in particular don't want to invest a huge amount of time on. And so it's kind of leave it to the professionals. And I think that's wrong, because there are some real strategic judgments that need to be made that require political leadership, and only our political leaders are empowered within our constitutions to make those decisions. The professionals can't. And so the main thing for me is that politicians need to appreciate that the issue hasn't gone away, that there are some difficult decisions to be made, and that it's their responsibility to make them. And once they've made those decisions and given us the boundaries of risk, then the professionals can get on with implementing that. But there does need to be political leadership.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. A fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to be here today, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Paula.